My girlfriend just bought this wrecked Land Rover Defender and she thinks she can rebuild it. She bought this car blind from an online auction. There's always that risk involved. And now she's committed to rebuilding crash damaged cars. Hannah's going to put in the bolt which holds the shock absorber to the lower arm.
Matt Armstrong just did what Bugatti's own engineers said was impossible. A $6 million hypercar, smashed beyond repair, roaring back to life in his garage. The internet erupted. Fans celebrated like it was their own victory. But his wife Hannah wasn't smiling. She was in tears, and not for the reason anyone assumed. For months, she carried a secret the cameras never caught, something far heavier than broken parts and torque numbers. Then she finally broke her silence, and 4 words changed the entire story. I almost lost him. What really happened behind that engine isn't what you saw online. Stay with us. Let's dive into the evidence and uncover the truth.
My girlfriend. And it was cheap. But there's one reason why this car is sat here for over a year now. Buying any crash damaged car.
A broken car that started everything. Hannah's tears made no sense to anyone watching online. The Bugatti was alive again. Fans were celebrating. Critics had gone quiet. But to understand why she was crying instead of smiling, you have to go back to a much smaller car, years before any of this began. Long before Matt Armstrong became a name millions of people recognized, he was a BMX rider. That was his whole identity. He had spent years building his skill, his body, and his sense of who he was around that one sport. Then a serious shoulder injury ended his career almost overnight. One day he had a sport and a future built around it. The next day, none of that was left. Losing something you built your entire life around does strange things to a person. It leaves a hole where purpose used to be. There's no manual for what to do next when the one thing you were sure about disappears without warning. Matt didn't find his way back through a plan or a business idea. He found it through a wrecked Audi TT sitting in an insurance auction.
Hannah had a little bit of an accident. The Audi TT, the project of...
Written off and forgotten by everyone except the man who spotted it. That car belonged to Hannah. She had crashed it. It had been declared a total loss, worth nothing to anyone but scrap value. Matt bought it for a few $100s anyway. No audience was waiting for him. No one expected the footage he filmed in his father's garage to matter to anybody. He just needed something broken that he could fix. Something that would respond to effort in a way his shoulder never would again. He had grown up around engines. His father, Tony, ran a garage, and Matt had spent his childhood learning the language of tools and parts before he ever learned the language of an audience. That background gave him something to fall back on when everything else fell apart. It wasn't glamorous. It was oil-stained hands and long, quiet evenings figuring out what was broken and how to make it work again. Slowly, people started watching. Not because the mechanics were flashy, but because there was something honest underneath it.
Creating a car dealership. Now, like, this is absolutely insane. And now it's taken the step from like a driveway mechanic.
A man rebuilding a car that used to belong to the woman he loved, piece by piece, in near silence, uploading the process for whoever happened to find it. That quiet, unglamorous start became the foundation of one of the biggest automotive channels on the internet. There were no instant viral moments in those early days, no sudden explosion of subscribers overnight. Growth came slowly, video by video, as more people stumbled across a story that felt real instead of staged. That slow build mattered. It meant the audience that eventually formed around Matt's channel wasn't chasing spectacle. They were following a story about starting over, and they stayed because that story kept being true. What almost nobody noticed at the time was how much Hannah carried once the channel began to grow. She wasn't just the person whose old car got a second life.
I hope this all goes well. And I'm actually quite scared for Hannah. She's going to have a really, really fast car.
As the audience expanded, she became the one answering the flood of messages, managing the filming schedule, running the merchandise operation, and keeping the business side steady, while Matt stayed focused on the garage floor. Every video that went out on time, every order that reached a customer without a hitch, every partnership that was handled properly had her fingerprints on it somewhere. Viewers only ever saw one half of the operation. The other half was working just as hard, just out of frame, with no credits and no comment section cheering her on. It's worth pausing on how unusual that early partnership really was. Most people who start a small channel from a garage never expect it to turn into a full business with staff, logistics, and a global audience. Fewer still expect to build that business alongside the same person whose crashed car started the whole thing. Matt and Hannah didn't plan any of it. It grew around them, one upload at a time, until neither of them could remember exactly when it stopped being a hobby. Nobody watching the channel back then would have guessed how much strain that balance could eventually hold. From the outside, it looked simple. A man fixing cars, a growing audience, a business that seemed to run itself. From the inside, it was two people quietly dividing an enormous workload between them, trusting that the other half was being handled even when neither of them talked about it out loud. That balance held for years, quietly and mostly unnoticed.
There was something broken and we put a fuse in and it was kept popping until we fixed the problem.
Then one phone call arrived that would test it harder than anything before, and would eventually explain why a woman who had never asked for attention would one day feel she had to speak. The $6 million risk. The offer sounded like a joke to most professionals in the industry. A Bugatti Chiron Per Sport, one of the rarest hypercars ever built, had been badly crashed and declared a total loss. Insurance companies wanted nothing to do with it. Specialists who had spent entire careers working on high-end machines looked at the damage and stepped away without a second thought. This wasn't an ordinary supercar with a dented panel and a cracked bumper. Every component inside a Chiron is engineered to work with every other component within a tolerance smaller than a fingernail's width. It is closer to aerospace engineering than to anything found in a typical repair shop. The people who built it were essentially saying that if it breaks, only they can put it back together. For most people, that alone would be reason enough to walk away. A car with almost no support network, no clear supply of parts, and a manufacturer unlikely to make anything easier. But Matt had spent years proving that written-off cars weren't always as finished as everyone assumed. This one was simply the biggest test of that belief he had ever faced. Matt said yes anyway. For him, it likely felt like the natural next step in a story that had been building since that first wrecked Audi. Every rebuild before this one, every late night in the garage, every small project that had grown his channel bit by bit, had led somewhere. This felt like the moment all of it had been pointing toward. A $6 million hypercar, a global audience watching in real time, a challenge nobody else in the world wanted to touch. Hannah heard the same phone call, but she understood it in a completely different way. She wasn't thinking about horsepower figures or how impressive the finished car would look on camera. She was thinking about what saying yes would actually cost. In time away from home, in energy he didn't have to spare, and in the version of Matt she would get to come home to each night once the project actually began. She had already watched stress wear him down on much smaller projects. Now the entire world would be watching this one, judging every decision he made, every delay, every setback that showed up on screen. She had no way of knowing yet how heavy that pressure would eventually become, or how close it would come to changing the man underneath all of it. What would you have done in her position? Would you have tried to talk him out of it? Would you have asked him to walk away from the opportunity of a lifetime? Or would you have stood behind him, knowing the price might be steeper than either of you could predict? Hannah chose to stand behind him. What she didn't know yet was how far apart that choice would eventually pull them, even while they were still talking to each other every single day. Looking back, it's easy to treat that decision as small, a quiet nod before the real drama began. But it wasn't small at all. It was Hannah agreeing to carry a weight she couldn't fully see yet, based on nothing more than trust in a man she had already watched rebuild one impossible thing before. Watched by millions, alone together. Once the rebuild became public, it stopped being just a mechanical project. Bugatti made the extraordinary decision to lock the car's identification number, cutting off access to official parts through any normal channel. What should have been a difficult repair became something close to impossible. Every solution required creative problem-solving that no manual and no factory expert had ever covered. Every setback that would have been a minor inconvenience on an ordinary project became a headline on this one. A delayed shipment, a part that didn't fit right the first time, a test that had to be repeated. None of that would raise an eyebrow on a normal build, but with the whole world watching, each small delay turned into fresh speculation about whether the project would ever actually finish. The automotive press picked up the story almost immediately. Journalists weighed in with strong opinions. Millions of people who had never touched a wrench in their lives suddenly became confident experts, filling comment sections with declarations about what Matt was doing wrong and whether the entire project was reckless in the first place. Some of the criticism was fair. Much of it was not. Either way, none of it stayed inside the workshop. It followed him home, into his voice during late-night phone calls, into pauses that lasted a beat too long. This is one of the harder truths about building something in public. The bigger an audience grows, the more the opinions of total strangers start to feel personal, even when those strangers have no real stake in the outcome and no idea what the work actually involves. It's a strange kind of pressure that most jobs never require anyone to face. Doing difficult, high-stakes work while thousands of people narrate every step out loud, questioning your judgment in real time, would test anyone. Even people with thick skin eventually feel the weight of that many voices, especially when the work itself is already exhausting on its own. Back home, Hannah was living a very different version of the same story. She wasn't in the workshop. She wasn't part of the online drama playing out every day in front of millions of people. She was adjusting to a quieter routine, one where the person she had built an entire life with was slowly becoming harder to reach, even on the phone, even when he was calling every single day like always. He was still calling. He was still present in the sense that mattered on paper. But the man on the other end of those calls was increasingly buried under something she couldn't fix from a distance. Something that didn't have a simple solution the way a stuck bolt or a broken part did. There's a specific kind of loneliness in that. It isn't the same as someone being physically gone. It's being in contact with someone while sensing that the most important parts of them are somewhere else entirely. Fighting a battle you cannot step into, no matter how much you want to. She couldn't talk about any of it publicly either. The rebuild was still ongoing. Millions of people were emotionally invested in every update, every setback, every small win. The last thing either of them needed was a headline suggesting trouble at home in the middle of the biggest project of Matt's career. So Hannah kept it to herself. She answered the messages, kept the schedule running, showed up in every practical way that mattered, and carried the weight quietly, with nowhere to set it down. There were no dramatic arguments, no single breaking point caught on camera, the way viewers might expect from a story like this. It was smaller than that, and somehow harder to describe. Long pauses on phone calls that used to be easy. Conversations that ended early, because exhaustion made it impossible to keep going. The slow, quiet feeling of watching someone drift further from themselves, one day at a time, with no single moment you could point to and say that's when it started. Anyone who has watched someone they love disappear into work they can't walk away from knows this feeling. You don't lose them all at once. You lose them in pieces, in missed calls that used to be easy, in a voice that sounds thinner than it used to, until one day you realize the distance has become the new normal, and you're not sure exactly when that happened. Later, Hannah would describe that entire stretch of time in 4 simple words. I almost lost him. The garage nobody saw. While the internet followed Matt's progress on the Kiran day by day, Hannah was starting a project of her own, one that almost nobody outside her closest circle knew anything about. She bought a damaged Land Rover Defender and began restoring it alongside her father, working on weekends and quiet evenings when the house felt too still. At first, it looked like a distraction, something physical to occupy her hands and her mind during a stretch of time that had grown increasingly lonely. There's nothing wrong with that kind of distraction. Used on purpose, it can be a genuine way of protecting yourself when everything else feels out of your hands. But somewhere along the way, the project became more than a way to pass the time. Each part she repaired, each problem she worked through with her father, started to mean something bigger than the vehicle itself. It became a way of putting herself back together, not as anyone's wife, not as the person quietly running a business behind the scenes, but simply as herself. A person with her own skill, her own patience, and her own quiet sense of what she was capable of. There's something steadying about working with your hands on a problem that responds directly to effort. When the rest of your life feels out of your control, a stuck bolt that finally turns is its own small kind of relief. The garage didn't know anything about comment sections or Bugatti parts shortages or online arguments about whether a project should have been attempted in the first place. It just gave her something honest to fix, one piece at a time. Think about the shape of that parallel for a moment. Matt's entire journey had started by rebuilding a car that once belonged to Hannah.
I have to update you on is the GT86, but unfortunately it's not here, so instead I'm gonna ask Matt a few questions about it while he's working on my car.
Back when neither of them had any idea it would turn into a career. Now, while he worked on the most famous car of his life, she was quietly rebuilding something in herself that months of pressure had been wearing down, without either of them fully realizing it. That isn't just a nice detail to add to the story for effect. It's the real story underneath the headlines. 2 people, 2 garages, 2 rebuilds, happening at the exact same time, each one invisible to the other's audience, each one just as demanding in its own way. Her father never made headlines for the hours he spent beside her in that garage, and he probably never expected to. But those hours mattered. Sometimes the most important support in a difficult season doesn't come with an audience at all. It comes quietly, from someone who just shows up and hands you the next tool without asking why you needed to be there. There's also something worth noticing in the timing of it all. Hannah didn't start this project after the Bugatti rebuild ended, once the pressure had already lifted. She started it in the middle of the hardest stretch, while the outcome was still uncertain, and the distance between her and Matt was still growing. When the engine finally spoke, after months of delays, missing parts, public doubt, and a project that seemed almost built to defeat him, the moment finally arrived. The Chiron's engine fired to life, 16 cylinders and 1,500 horsepower.
T-Chiron Supersport has an 8-litre quad-turbo W16, 1,600 horsepower, 1,600 newton-meters of torque, all-wheel drive.
And the sound carried across the garage like a verdict nobody had been sure would ever come. Months of frustration seemed to disappear in that single moment. Every doubt from the comment sections, every part shortage, every long night spent solving a problem nobody had solved before, All of it led to this one sound filling the garage. For the people watching online, it was pure celebration. A car the entire industry had written off was running again, brought back by a man who refused to accept that it couldn't be done. Comment sections filled instantly with praise. Critics who had spent months predicting failure went quiet almost overnight, and clips of that engine turning over spread across the internet within hours. Hannah's reaction was different. When she heard that engine start, she cried, and she's been honest about what those tears actually meant. They had nothing to do with the car's value or the online victory laps happening in real time. She cried because in that sound, she recognized something she had been missing for months. Matt was coming back. Not the version of him that had been buried under stress and criticism for half a year. The version she actually knew. The one who was fully present and fully himself. The relief in that moment wasn't really about a successful repair. It was the release of someone who had been quietly holding her breath for a long time, finally allowed to exhale after months of not knowing how it would end. When she was later asked about everything she had gone through, the distance, the loneliness, the months of watching someone she loved fade a little more each week, she said something worth sitting with for a moment. She said she would do it all again. That statement tells you something important about what her original confession actually meant. "I almost lost him" was never about a marriage falling apart in the usual sense. It was about almost losing the version of Matt who was grounded, present, and fully there. Public pressure at this scale doesn't announce itself with a single dramatic moment. It works slowly, wearing down the parts of a person that make them who they are, until the change is so gradual that nobody notices it happening until it already has. Nobody outside that relationship saw the late-night calls where he sounded worn thin and far away. Nobody else carried that knowledge for months, while still showing up every single day to keep the business running, the schedule on track, and the messages answered. Hannah did, quietly, and when she finally spoke about it, she wasn't looking for sympathy or trying to take credit away from what Matt achieved. She simply believed the full story deserved to be told honestly. The world will remember this rebuild as one of the biggest moments in automotive content. A car nobody thought could be saved, brought back against every expert opinion in the industry. That part of the story is real, and Matt earned every bit of it. But underneath it sits another story that deserves just as much attention. A partnership that carried the full weight of an impossible project for months, and somehow didn't break under it. It would have been easy for Hannah to stay silent forever. The project succeeded. The car ran. The internet moved on to the next story within weeks. Nobody would have blamed her for keeping the harder parts private for good. But she chose to speak anyway, not for attention, and not to take anything away from Matt's achievement, but because she understood that the full truth mattered more than a tidy highlight reel. Matt Armstrong will always be remembered for bringing a $6 million Bugatti back from the edge of total loss. But the quieter story, the one about a marriage that carried the full weight of that project without breaking, might be the part worth remembering most of all. 2 people, 2 garages, 2 rebuilds nobody planned for, and somehow both of them came through it together, on the other side, still standing. So here's the question worth asking yourself. Does knowing this change how you see that engine coming back to life? Does it make the achievement feel bigger, or does it make you think differently about what a project like this really costs? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe for more stories like this one, and drop a comment telling us which part stuck with you the most. We'll see you in the next video.